Hi, and welcome to the Clayton Utz Generative AI Podcast Miniseries. I'm your host, Will Howe. I lead Clayton Utz's data analytics capability, where we are building with generative AI technologies. Got a really exciting session today on how does generative AI apply to our public sector space. And so I'm joined by three really fantastic guests from the firm who I'll introduce now. Robert Dearn is a partner in Clayton Utz's public sector practice based in Canberra. He specializes in complex and high-value digital transformation projects and has a particular focus on government procurement, strategic outsourcing, technology products, and data commercialization. Eleanor Dickens is a partner in a public sector group in Brisbane who practices in administrative and public law. She's got extensive experience advising public sector agencies, regulators, and decision makers on a broad range of administrative law issues, including decision-making processes, information privacy, FOI, RTI, and data, integrity ethics, and corruption and administrative investigations and review processes. She was voted by her peers as one of Australia's best lawyers in public law and named as Public Lawyer of the Year for 2021-2022. Ashley Tsacalos is a leading dispute resolution and litigation lawyer who's based in Sydney, including in the areas of administrative and public law. He's one of Australia's leading experts in royal commissions and inquiries as part of his involvement in most of the royal commissions and inquiries in recent years. He has an extensive knowledge in public policy issues as well as a unique and deep understanding of the workings of government. So that's the panel. Thank you very much all for joining us. And so to start with, Rob, we'll maybe start with you. We've heard all this hype before from all the salespeople and the tech folks. What's different this time around?
Yeah, thanks, Will. Look, a really interesting question. I'm not sure if my my answer might disappoint you. Let's see. So look, from a technology evolution perspective, the key leap is that generative AI has enabled the creation of tools that generate apparently original content. And so, but this technology isn't really that new. We've all had the benefit of, Google seeking to complete sentences that we write in our emails and recommending the names of recipients. So it's not really new, but really the thing that's changed, the kind of spark that's having the sort of the impact lies in the fact that companies like OpenAI and Midjourney have put the technology in the hands of the public in a chatbot, so it's immediately accessible and able to be used for sort of almost dizzyingly diverse ways. The other thing is, and again, I think this is the bit that might take us away from the kind of the technical piece into the more, I guess, the social impact or cultural impact, is that the thing that's changed, I think, is the speed with which the technology is evolving. So typically major shifts in relation to technological evolution have taken time. So whether, for something like the Industrial Revolution, the change to industrialize processes took significant amount of time, and there was an opportunity for practices and behaviors to be established around those technologies as they emerged. Even the personal computer, which is something that we treat as standard now, it evolved relatively slowly. But in this instance with generative AI, we're seeing technology evolve at a frightening pace. We've had, reportedly once in a generation sort of technological leaps happening almost monthly in this space. And I really think that does change the game. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly is I think generative AI, one of the biggest differences for generative AI is actually how it makes us feel, which I think is part of the marketing guff, but I think it's real. So I don't have a computer science degree, but I can generally understand how computers work and how processes that underpin IT solutions that I advise clients on work. Well, generative AI takes this to a different space. I feel like I'm dealing with a technology that I can't quite pin down. Now, I know that generative AI tools generally are using things like large language models and probabilistic pattern recognition to come up with an outcome. But there's a patina of magic about it. And I think that, even though that's part of the hype, I think that sprinkle of fairy dust is actually the thing that is making this new technology so exciting. And so while it is hype, I also think it's having a significant impact on what this technology means for both the way we work and the way our clients work.
That's a good way to describe it, Robert. There is a bit of magic in it, isn't there, at the moment? And I guess, for all of us, we've probably had a chance at least to play with it a little bit as end users and as individuals and as citizens. But for public sector organizations, there's sort of a different angle on that. I guess, Eleanor, from your perspective, how does this apply particularly into the public sector?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question and in some senses a never-ending one. But for generative AI, at the moment, at this point in time, noting that these things change so rapidly and there's almost a critical mass moment every week with some of these technologies, for government, generative AI is an opportunity to sort of obviously use that generative capacity to do things like generate communication materials, so reports, to summarize extensive document and information holdings. And say, for instance, and that's one of the things that government has a lot of is data and information. So to be able to get across those information holdings, and instead of having an officer, review 30 boxes of documents, you can have generative AI do that and produce a summary. So there's also applications for producing notices, producing statement of reasons, even those sorts of applications, and also doing things, just going back to that capacity that it has to generate content and sort of summary-based content, doing things like if you had a large public consultation process, for instance, and you had, say, 10,000 submissions, you could use generative AI to produce a summary of that. I've also heard of it being used to summarize preferred candidates, like a recruitment process. So there's a range of uses that it can have and opportunities that it can present for government. I think the main sort of theme, though, is that it can be a tool that can be used to do that grunt work associated with, getting across large parcels of information and being able to produce a summary, and sort of taking people off that sort of work, and to even think about putting them into streams of work which are more care and human focused. So that's probably the biggest point of utility that I see for government with generative AI.
Just to sort of emphasise what it might mean for the public service as well. So David Thodey did a review of the federal public service a little while ago, and he identified that 40% of APS employee time is spent on tasks that he was able to designate as highly automatable tasks. Now, that is a really interesting statistic if you look at the potential use cases of something like generative AI, if it could be applied to those highly automatable tasks. And so a lot of government work sort of sits at that white collar space that really you can look to implement generative AI tools to replace some of the work that's done, as Eleanor said, focus the work of government on the sort of more human components of it, which I think is going to be a massive asset. I just want to make one point that Eleanor made around public consultation. I also think government needs to think of about how generative AI works in reverse as well. So if you can imagine a public consultation process where you are seeking information from government, and you consider the challenge that'll be faced if we go out for public comment and, armed with a tool like ChatGPT, a single interest group could generate, for instance, 1 million responses, all that sounded original, all that sounded like they were written by a human, and submit them in relation to the public comment. So the barriers in terms of engagement, if, for instance, the public uses generative AI to interact with government, pose a real challenge. And so these are the types of shifts that I think that we need to think about, and our clients need to think about around how it will work.
And Rob, I've actually had some discussions with clients on this very point, that we might see sort of through that mass use for that purpose of generative AI, we may see like a real distortion of public consultation processes. And so it's actually trying to think of ways that we can, and it's not just about checking to see if a submission's been generated by AI, because that won't obviously solve the issue. It's thinking about, well, how can we have a check and balance to make sure that we don't have, 30,000 submissions of a certain nature, which actually only can be pinned down to, say, 10 various people or groups. So there will be a range of responsive actions that need to come as well.
It does feel a little bit like with this technology, it's a double-edged sword. And as much as there's great opportunities, also there's some really unique challenges. And I started my career in the public sector. And so, I'm really alive to that. It's near and dear to my heart. And so public sector organizations, Ashley, I think, from your perspective, what are some of the unique risks that public sector organizations need to be thinking about at the moment?
Thanks, Will. And then what Rob and Eleanor has just discussed are, I think, some of the risks that have been borne out already and will no doubt bear out over time. But even just government thinking about it in reverse in the way that has just been discussed, I think presents a real risk because it has the ability to distort perhaps opposition to certain programs or policies or issues and so forth. And I know there's been some discussion, for example, in the education space. One way to alleviate some of those issues is to go old school, so to speak, and for students to do written exams again, and you almost come full circle. And that way you can definitely assure yourself that the product that a student is producing is their own, assuming it's done in the right examination-controlled environment. But in terms of risks more generally, I agree with your comment. Obviously, there's great opportunity in terms of promoting consistency, accuracy, for example, in decision-making. It's cost-effective and you can do more with less, and that's an increasing challenge for government, the importance of doing more with less in tight budgetary and economic times. And there's an expectation that all government does that and watches the taxpayer dollar and value for money, etc. We've all heard those concepts. But the risk of, in essence, taking shortcuts is not, I certainly not in an advertent way, but in an inadvertent way is I think, part of the potential great risk, because how you deploy and utilize this technology needs to be carefully considered in the design, planning, implementation phase. And it's not a set and forget option either. It has to be constantly monitored because I think there are great efficiencies that can be gained, but if there's some defective methodology that might play the rollout of a particular program or a particular series of decisions and so forth, then that's going to be problematic long term and can have catastrophic consequences on a grand scale that we haven't seen before. So where I see the challenges for government in terms of risk is government is subject to just so much more scrutiny than any other private sector organisation, whether it's through accountability bodies like the Ombudsman, anti-corruption commissions, parliamentary inquiries, royal commissions and inquiries, and so forth. So it needs to be thinking about how it ensures that not only for proper public policy reasons, but how can some of the technology that they do implement in that generative AI space is going to survive proper scrutiny? What are the risks from that perspective? But also even just from an accountability measure, is it taking the appropriate steps of recording, for example, decisions in an appropriate way? Is it able to then retrieve the information in response to a right to information or FOI or IPA request, depending on your jurisdiction? And how does it provide that information? And finally, in relation to circumstances across the country where there's record-keeping obligations, state records, archiving obligations, how is some of this information stored and how are government agencies and departments complying with their respective record-keeping obligations? So there's some of the risks. There are others, but that's it in a nutshell.
And if I could just add to that, Ashley, I completely agree with that. And some of the accountability, the standard accountability mechanisms that we have, those will need to either have a massive skill investment. So I'm working with a regulator presently about using a really complex algorithm to not just guide their regulatory decision-making processes, but to actually be responsible for direct regulatory action. And even though we're sort of getting off topic for generative AI, but I will just say that in terms of a decision that's, say, subject to review that's been made by that algorithm, I just can't see And I've looked at, there's been reviews and reports done on this algorithm to sort of try to future-proof it in terms of review. And I think people will, before we even get to the legalities and say, looking at the judicial review of that, or, it's people actually being able to understand what that technology is, how it works. And if you're a decision maker, and you're that's been used as part of your decision-making process, you be comfortable with that algorithm, so there's a whole the risk also is that if we don't see that sort of skills investment, understanding, we won't actually, the public sector won't actually have the capacity for itself to understand and even from that first principles be comfortable and accountable with what's happening and what they're actually applying. So that's one of the major issues that I see as well, in addition to those ones, Ashley, that you've identified.
Yeah, and accountability and transparency of executive action, as you say, Eleanor, is at the very essence of what the public sector does, and being able to outline the basis for a decision becomes a lot more difficult when you are dealing with algorithms and the like. And so, and therefore, how that plays out into review mechanisms, both merits review and judicial review, tribunals, internal decision makers, and then ultimately courts will have to grapple with those sorts of matters. So I think certainly thinking about those factors when you are seeking to implement the technology, I always say to those that I advise that you've just got to imagine, rather than it appearing on the front page of the paper, yes, of course, that's one test, but the ultimate test is how will it stand up in the Royal Commission in 5 years' time, and what would you wish that you did now in 5 years' time, and thinking and trying to fast forward yourself into that Royal Commission, not wishing that upon anyone, but in essence that is a real risk for government, and we've seen that play out. But also thinking carefully about what sort of decisions, for example, from a sound administrative decision-making perspective, that some of the generative AI would be more appropriate for. So where there's more pre-programmed, mandatory factors or considerations, non-discretionary aspects of decision-making is going to be a lot more amenable to generative AI technology, rather than, for example, where there's discretionary factors. And I'll just leave on this point in terms of this answer, and that is the importance that I'm not a technology expert, but I've read enough to know that generative AI is based on historical data, and it sweeps up a huge reservoir of historical data, which may in itself contain various biases that would then impact what it spits out in the current times, which may not be fit for purpose in 2023, for example, but was highly appropriate in 1960. And but it does sweep up that rich reservoir of data that's in the across the internet and so forth, and those sorts of things need to be considered as well.
And Ashley and Eleanor, you touched on where decision makers are involved in this. One of the unique and interesting elements in this is just how democratized this tech has been. You don't need $1 million budget to get it. You can log on to ChatGPT and anyone can get access to the basic version for free. So what happens when some bright spark starts experimenting with this, very well-meaning, starts plugging citizen data into there and using some of these outputs without actually going through some of these decision-making processes? Is that a real challenge that public sector organizations are dealing with at the moment?
Certainly, I'm happy to kick off and then pass on to Eleanor. I think that is a real risk, and that's why you need to have the proper governance models and accountability measures internally within government to make sure that you have those matters at the forefront of your mind. Where are the weaknesses? Where are the potential vulnerabilities or deficiencies in a particular scheme or policy or administrative decisions that you want to implement using this technology? And how do you mitigate or eliminate some of those risks? And I do think there are enormous, and I'll leave Eleanor to talk about the privacy issues, but that's where I see some significant issues as well. And we've seen obviously some very well-known recent data breaches and privacy breaches, both in the private sector and the public sector, and the wealth of data that is now available means that it is harder to preserve that data, and let alone talking about cyber risk and cyber accessing information by foreign actors for nefarious purposes, for example. But over to you, Eleanor.
Yeah, actually, I would wholeheartedly agree. The governance piece, I think, is absolutely critical, and particularly to do that proactively, do that immediately. Because nothing's worse than retrofitting governance. We all know how difficult that can be, and particularly with information and data that's held. And what you're going to do with it. So governance frameworks for me are super, super critical, because also, and if we acknowledge that these platforms will be applied, they do present, as Rob said earlier, the 30-day review that was done, it's almost like there's some degree of inevitability to this, and also that in order to meet revenue challenges, skill shortages, we need to adopt these technologies. So if these governance arrangements aren't put in place, there's a risk that we won't get a social license. And the community won't trust these technologies, and that will be fatal for them. So for me, the governance aspect, and also acknowledging that sort of data and information has a history. So that sort of proactive approach with governance, review mechanisms, building those processes in, and doing that sort of not after you've seen a few things fail, actually hardwire them into your framework and be thinking about data plans it's almost like you want to see a privacy by design approach applied to the uptake of these technologies, where you're proactively thinking about the risks and then building your project to deal with those risks, or the uptake of that technology to deal with those risks, as opposed to implementing it and then having like a patchwork of governance arrangements to try and fix it once it's fully embedded, which we all know just won't work, because we'll probably see, maladaptive processes and things like that develop to sort of support the system, particularly as these things, are large and can get a life of their own.
And I wholeheartedly support the importance of this governance regime, and I think so. And one thing, and just to sort of put a bow on it, like really, it's the human cost that can arise from the use of these tools in a public sector context, which is different. So, and I think that difference needs to be recognised with how we embrace it. And I think government needs to be able to experiment with AI. Government needs to be able to try and maximise the potential, but at the same time, they need guardrails to ensure that is done safely. And really, so we've seen some initiatives. So the New South Wales government has the AI assurance framework, which sort of provides a mechanism whereby you do something similar to a privacy impact assessment in relation to sort of AI tools, which I think is the type of initiative we probably need to see more broadly in a government context. And so I think the federal government is currently working on some AI tools, AI governance tools as well. And so I think that's going to be really critically important. The other thing is, I just want to point out that we can create these governance arrangements, but it's going to be absolutely imperative that AI tools are continually tested and verified by humans as they are implemented. Because really, I think the identification of harms and risks are things that are going to emerge over time and won't necessarily be known at the outset.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree, Rob. And that was my comment at the outset around it's not set and forget. You need a feedback loop. You need an ongoing QC process. And I think it's also at the planning, design implementation phases. I think you need people who are going to play devil's advocate, who are going to stress test the application of this technology. And therefore, I think you need multidisciplinary approach in terms of the expertise and skills that people bring to the table when examining whatever it is that the generative AI is being deployed for. I think that is critical. And you made that point very well, Rob, around the human cost and the catastrophic consequences of getting this wrong. There is an expectation government will embrace it, as Eleanor said, and as I was saying, that in tight financial circumstances and trying to do more with less, there will be that expectation. But the public service is acutely aware that it is the custodian of public money, and it takes that obligation very seriously. And ultimately, where this goes is to the accountability and transparency of executive action, but also the trust factor in government is critical. And it was something that peaked during the height of the COVID pandemic, but has dissipated over time for a range of reasons, and no doubt the post-COVID pandemic has contributed to that. But there are other factors that have contributed to that, and that does undermine the work of government more generally. And I think that trust factor is important.
And Ashley, you mentioned government embracing this technology. Maybe we just follow up on that a little bit. In the 2019 independent review of the Australian Public Service, it was called out that Australia was at an early stage of digital literacy and behind comparable governments. Do you see this as an opportunity to potentially close that gap?
Yeah, and I think, ironically, Will, between 2019 and 2023 in digital literacy is light years, in the sense that I think so much happened so quickly, as we saw during the pandemic, out of necessity. You know what they say, necessity is the greatest teacher. And I think the public service did a remarkable job in that period, like the private sector did, to adapt. People became more nimble and agile. So I think a lot of that gap has been bridged already. In saying that, and Rob touched on the 30 review, there's always more to be done, because this technology, and Rob made this point earlier, is moving at such a great pace and greater than it has ever before, that what is current today is out of date tomorrow. So I think it's something that you, like anything, you constantly have to work on it and focus on it. And I think, the Service New South Wales example is a great example of certainly New South Wales, how that app became so important, and its increasing functionality and so forth. And I know that's been modelled in other states and territories and at the federal government level as well. I think there needs to be, and will be inevitably, more engagement from a digital perspective with the citizens of the country. And that's where I think ensuring that you don't leave people behind in that space. It is user-friendly, it is reliable, and doesn't suffer any of the issues that we've been talking about, which would undermine confidence and trust in government, and ultimately does what it should do in a way that government actions could ultimately be scrutinised in the proper way that it ought to.
Can I add to that? So I think, I wholeheartedly support Ashley's comment that there has been an evolution within government in terms of how it deals with technology. So the instructions and the project leads that we deal with in relation to IT procurement are just like, we're dealing with experts that have incredible experience these days. So that digital literacy thing, I think, has shifted. I think the biggest issue is it's always going to be relative in terms of what the public sector does versus what the private sector does. And I actually think there's a chance that we actually widen the chasm between what the private sector does and what the public sector does, if we don't create an environment in which the public sector can safely use this technology. So it would be easy for government leaders to say that this is just basically a pure risk, and as a consequence we can't adopt it. As a consequence we can't use it. And then we have a situation in which government, which has an enormous corpus of data that it could apply to these types of tools, is sidelining itself from the use of this innovative technology. So I actually think that government's smart enough. Certainly the Digital Transformation Agency's CEO was out recently encouraging staff. So we're saying, look, not telling staff to use it for government purposes, but encouraging staff to think about how Gen AI could be applied to use cases in government. And I think what we need to do is we need to create that support structure for them to take appropriate risks to ensure that we're not left behind in the use of this type of technology.
And if I could just add to that, I think one of the pieces in this is the public sector actually telling people that they're using it, because I think that's one of the issues. That's, even things like automated decisions have been, there's legislative changes that happened probably 20 years ago to facilitate that. But there's never been a lot of discussion around how the state, how public servants, how the public sector has been using that technology. And when people have found out, they've been quite surprised. On one level, some others have been quite shocked, depending on the outcome. So I think, to me, that's part. I totally agree with you, Rob, in terms of that. If the public sector doesn't embrace it, there is that risk that it will be left behind. But I think part of doing that is not only, of course, embracing it, but actually telling the public that we are going to be using it. And obviously, there's issues around how much you discuss that and what the scope of the information you provide. But I think there needs to be that understanding with the community that it's being used as a first principle.
And that safe space to experiment. Just from a Clayton Utz perspective, we've been very fortunate to be able to move at pace with this tech here. And we've built out solutions in the ESG space, in the obligations management space, in the industrial relations space. And our real benefit is the fact that we've got technologists surrounded by many lawyers, as you'd imagine, in this building. And so being able to think through in detail some of these novel risks that are emerging from this new technology, and some of them are really apparent. And I think our experience inside Clayton Utz using this technology has been that some of the risks we didn't exist before. The technology itself created new and interesting challenges to work through, and thankfully we've been able to create that safe space, Robert, as you've called it, through very close legal guardrails and a lot of legal analysis that goes into it. So as a technologist, I actually feel that lawyers right now are the real key to unlocking some of this opportunity, managing and working through that risk. And Eleanor, to your perspective, to your point, how do we communicate that and be open and transparent? And I think Australians in general will obviously be wanting their representatives to act appropriately, but also, be proud and move quickly on this. And I guess to that point, Rob, I'd love to get your thoughts. I know you're involved in procuring some of these major complex digital transformations. Clayton Utz, amongst others, is suggesting that there's the rise of the foundation models. So GPT is one of them. There are other foundation models being developed by other large organizations, such as Google, and also in China. Notably, none of these foundation models have been developed in Australia yet. Is there actually a national strategic interest for us here? And do we need to be doing more as a nation?
It's a really fascinating question, and I suspect that we almost need sort of sociologists, philosophers, and others on this meeting to really to drive down into some of that. So, look, I think one of the challenges that Australia has is if the reality is that generative AI is the, I guess, the smarts in relation to generative AI is held by a very few corporate players. So I think there's about 5 or 6 large companies that currently have the technology to both develop generative AI and to deploy it at scale. And generally they aren't going to be Australian based, but this is also true for a number of other technologies that we use. So, for instance, the Australian government didn't turn and look at Google and say, well, we needed to create a sort of a public sector or a sort of a publicly funded search engine that was uniquely Australian and ensured that we had Australian results. So I think the challenge that we have as a country is to consider some of the risks we've discussed around how generative AI is going to be applied, and ensuring that the insights or the content that's generated through these tools is appropriate for Australia. So I don't think it is viable for us to potentially compete with the large corporate players, but I think there's potential role for government to think about how it could ensure that Australian datasets are used as part of the creation and as part of the training of these tools. So generative AI has almost involved this sort of capture of the commons, that we've got this, we've had this sort of a couple of years of web scraping that's resulted in the creation of these, in the case of something like ChatGPT, these large language models. And so the question is, do we need to, for instance, make data sets available to Australian businesses that to improve that data set? Do we need that, for instance, do we need to tune the data sets for an Australian context? I think these are really complex challenges that we need to we need to take on. But I would suggest that what we will ultimately do is we'll be standing on the shoulders of the giants, the tech giants, and those foundational models, and then looking to train them and tweak them for the applications that they have. And I think the government has a role to play to ensure through things like open data that there's an ability to imbue these systems with information that's relevant for an Australian public.
And so, Eleanor, I guess following the theme that AI is here to stay, what are a few of the things that public sector organizations should be doing to make sure that they're effective users and adopters of this AI technology?
Wow. We could talk a lot about that, Will. Look, I would say first thing is, obviously there needs to be, and our discussion today has, everyone's drawn these things out, but obviously an awareness and understanding of AI technologies, and that is ongoing, not just to test and make sure that there's an ongoing awareness and understanding of these technologies as they change, but also what they can do. And the more we use them, the more insights we'll get. So there's that understanding, keeping at pace about that, and with that, establishing sort of almost like a legal risk tool where you can, have some sort of solid basis to be testing what legal risks you're picking up. We've got a tool at Clayton Utz, and we've identified about 75, sort of core legal risks. Also, and Ashley, you spoke about this before about suitability. That there you have some sort of, I've been calling it a suitability matrix, where there's a review done, and it's done, and it's almost like an ongoing process where there's an assessment of which types of business processes, which types of decisions, what are the appropriate areas of public sector operations that these types of technologies are appropriate for. And I would also say that if an organisation, if an agency is wanting to start implementing and thinking about implementing AI, that review is done hand in glove with these, legal tool, risk register, and a suitability matrix, so that, because a lot of the times the legal issues, suitability issues, can actually frame what type of product you should be purchasing. So we wouldn't want to see a process, as we sometimes see, where you have a change manager come in, consultancy do a review, and then a legal review is done at the last as sort of like a bolt-on. I think there needs to be consistency and working together in those sorts of processes. And the final thing I'd say, and I've said it earlier, and we've all sort of touched on it, is governance and setting up those governance arrangements. They're the things, if I was a public servant, they're the things that I'd be thinking about.
Perfect. Well, look, lots of things to think about. Maybe we bring this to a conclusion then. So I guess let's talk top 3 actions for what our watchers should be thinking about. Maybe Robert, from yourself first, what are the top 3 things?
Yeah, look, so Eleanor just gave a really great snapshot as to what I think that the focus needs to be in terms of how this technology is adopted. Well, I might take a different slant on it and actually look more at the sort of slightly more ambitious in terms of how government should potentially be lead into this technology. So firstly, I think government needs to start experimenting, and government and public servants need to start thinking about what use cases exist and how this technology can be used. And I also just think that it's absolutely imperative that government skills up in this space. We cannot be left behind. The industry that's now emerging around just even prompt writing is such that if government doesn't get its hands on this stuff and start using it, there's going to be a skill gap, and I think that's really key. And just to augment as my third from what Eleanor said, I think it's really imperative that that departments that develop internal organisational policies that guide just that simple question about where and how AI can be used. Now, the governance models I think are critical, but just give them a steer as to what's the expectation that the department has in relation to how its staff should use it.
Thank you, Rob. And Eleanor, top 3.
Well, I think skills, getting up to skills and understanding it, not being afraid of it, because it's I've been saying it's here to stay. Skills development, an awareness of the change, understanding that constantly, and sort of with that change, understanding the legal risks and the suitability issues. And then for me, and I'll say it again, the governance aspect to it. And not just, and when I talk about governance, Rob, I agree with you in terms of policies about people understanding what they can and can't do. Just they're critical as well.
Thanks, Eleanor and Ashley. Top 3 actions for public servants.
Well, I think certainly, as we said, and I think you said it at the outset, Will, where there's great challenges, there's great opportunities, and to understand what this technology means for your particular organisation, your particular role. Certainly within government, the people will be thinking quite carefully about how this technology could be deployed, and for the benefit of the citizen, and to ensure efficiency and timeliness, consistency, all those things that we've talked about already, but also how it's going to survive the usual accountability and transparency measures. So how is this technology, if deployed, how are you going to comply with your existing obligations within government, whether that is the right to information type regime, FOI, GIPA and the like, other bodies that scrutinise government action, so the Ombudsman, anti-corruption commissions and so forth, and making sure that the way the technology is deployed is going to stand up to scrutiny and going to comply with, for example, the sound administrative law decision-making principles. It's going to be capable of being defended in a merits review or a judicial review, all those traditional methods of scrutiny that government faces. And lastly, I would apply the Royal Commission lens ultimately to whatever is deployed, to say, well, we should stress test this from the perspective of where could it go wrong, and if it did go wrong, how could it go wrong? And that will give you a very good sense of the gaps you have, the deficiencies and vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, whether it be by lawyers or non-lawyers. And applying that lens, I think, gives you a really good sense of how to mitigate or eliminate, as the case may be, the risks that are posed by the deployment of this technology.
Well, can I just say one thing? Sorry, I just
No problem.
was thinking about it as I'm listening to Rob, listening to Ashley, and thinking about the various perspectives we bring to this. For me, one of the main thing, it's almost like an assumption, is the criticality of information and data, and how, because that sits at the base to all of this. And I'm sort of, working from a jurisdiction where that base isn't working well, and there's no sort of work being done to shore up the base. So it's almost like if you're not investing, if you're not spending money in terms of getting your information systems at the base, doing that, thinking about everything that you need to make sure that your information and your data is absolutely as best standard as it could be. Because if that's not done properly, it will severely hamstring and limit all of these technologies, and actually, could affect how they function. So it's almost like that's actually, and maybe that's an particular insight that I have coming from a jurisdiction where that is not being done. And I think that is going to actually set those agencies right back at the pack, because it'll be a patchwork application.
Fantastic insights. Thank you, Ashley, Eleanor, and Rob. Appreciate your time today, and thanks to you, our watchers, for being with us on this journey, and look forward to seeing you at the next episode.